Watch this. No way!
So, Stephen, thank you so much for returning on the podcast. Now, we are going to be releasing this in the week leading up to the Open. It's one of two that we're doing. We're kind of doing, well, I've already recorded one with Joe McDonnell, which was the evolution of the course at Hoylake. And
right.
then we were in discussions and thinking about who could we speak to that knew quite a lot about the evolution of sort of the club and the players and the Open Championship, and who do we know that knows everything about these things? And obviously your name just jumped straight off the page, and it's going to be pretty much exactly a year since the last time you were on the podcast. So Stephen, welcome back to the podcast.
I tell you what, it's nice to be back. I'm a huge fan of Cookie Jar Golf, and Joe McDonnell for that matter. So it's great to be on, and I'm just looking forward to talking.
That's why we get you on, because you always say nice things about us, which is quite nice. Not many people do, but what have you been doing? I know that we just talked a little bit prior to rolling about some work in the pipeline. What have you got coming up that could be interesting that our listeners might want to get on board with?
Well, I tell you, the first thing that'll be coming out for me next June is going to be a magazine that is about the Old Tom Morris Golf Trail, which Bonnie Weave Golf created in 2021 to celebrate Old Tom Morris's 200th birthday. Last June, I got to go and play all 18 courses on the trail, and since then I have been writing about it. 18 essays, one about each of the course. I created a couple eclectic 18 style presentations based on that are along the Old Tom Morris Trail. And I also have written a large essay about Old Tom that really explores his work as a discoverer of golf holes. So that comes out next June. Lauren Rubenstein has done me the favor of writing the foreword, so that'll be exciting for people.
Yeah, that is nice.
And Roger McStravick is going to do an afterward. So looking forward to that publication. And I think it'll be something that's of interest, especially to people who enjoy golf architecture and golf travel.
Just what's the significance of the 18, before we roll into the main part of the podcast, what's the significance of the 18 courses? Because obviously he was involved with very, very many golf courses.
Tom Morris ended up designing or consulting on 100 golf courses in his lifetime. And the trail comprises 17 of those, but it also adds North Berwick, partly because North Berwick is just one of the most fun golf courses to play in the entire world, but also because North Berwick is a course that was really pivotal in Tom's life, and it presented exactly the kind of golf that Tom went out and discovered and created himself. So it belongs on there in that respect, both of those respects. You know, many big events happened in Tom's life at North Berwick. He made his bones as a golfer there. You know, the fatal telegram that came for his son, fateful telegram that came for his son was delivered there. So a lot of his life unfolded on that links. And so that's what the significance of it is, to recognize Tom's achievement in spreading the game of golf at a critical moment in his history.
And where can people get this if they want to get that magazine? Where can people get hold of it?
The Old Tom Morris Trail, when the magazine is published next June, they will make it available for sale on their website, which also very soon is going to have coins that you can obtain if you have played one of the 18 golf courses on the trail. These are fabulous looking coins. Each coin has an image of Old Tom on the front and says Old Tom Morris Trail, along with the name of the golf course, the 18 courses. And on the back is the crest of the golf club itself. And if you get all 18, as I have done, they have a whiskey cask. The front of a whiskey cask that is created, handcrafted to declare that you played the Old Tom Morris Trail, shows a map of the trail, and all 18 of the coins are displayed in it. Going to make a pretty cool thing for my writing room when my cask finally arrives. But I've gone out and gotten the 18 coins, so that's the first part. But I think that'll be something for golfers that they'll find exciting too, and that's going to be opening here in the next month or so.
Oh, nice. And going from, I mean, the reason we got you on was kind of discuss the Open, because it's such a just an exciting time of the year when it comes to the golfing calendar, the last major of the season, really. But going from old Tom, that kind of started it all at Prestwick, really. Tell us a little bit about the background of the Open Championship. I'm sure many of our listeners are aware of it. And then we're going to move on to kind of how young Tommy got involved, and then we're going to get into Hoylake.
Yes, the Open Championship really was the outgrowth of a notion that had started to take hold in the 1850s or 60s when golf was really starting to spread around a little bit. And a man named James Ogilvie Farley, who was the founder of Prestwick, and also, as almost all big golf club leaders were in those age, he belonged to St. Andrews and other clubs as well. He got the idea that there should be a national championship. It shouldn't just be your club medal. There should be something that declared who's the best golfer in Scotland. Naturally, his first instinct was an amateur event. And so the first national championship of any kind ever held in Scotland was an amateur foursomes competition that was conducted in 1857 at St. Andrews. And it was actually won by the team from Blackheath in England. But of course,
is that right?
Blackheath may have physically been in England, but every single person who played there was a Scotsman. And most of them were also members at other leading Scottish clubs, including St. Andrews. So that went on until 1859. And then basically what happened was St. Andrews came to the conclusion, it was held at St. Andrews, that it interrupted the autumn meeting, and that the autumn meeting was way more important than this thing. And it just ended up dying out. The very next year, Ogilvie Farley, the same guy, decided, okay, Allen Robertson died in 1859. He was the champion golfer of his age. And partly because of that, partly because of the decline of this national amateur event, he decided that Prestwick would host an Open Championship for professional golfers. Now, in that first year, it was only limited to professionals. So only what you would call respectable caddies is the way they put it at Prestwick were invited to play. And so there was a very small field of 8 golfers, I believe, if memory serves. And that was 1860. The challenge that was laid down was that they presented a belt to the winner, a big silver buckled belt with red Moroccan leather. And the challenge was, if you could win the Open 3 times in a row, the belt became your personal property. And it was quite valuable. It was 25 pounds, which was half of Tom's annual salary when he got to Prestwick in 1864, to St. Andrews, in 1864. So it was worth a lot. And so a quest developed for that. And it was during the years of that quest that it turned out that old Tom's son would be the person who destined to claim the belt, which he did in 1870. And that really established the Open as a thing that would last. And partly because it led to Prestwick asking St. Andrews and Musselburgh to join in. And they bought the claret jug, and then there was a rota. And that was the beginning of all things as far as the Open Championship was concerned.
During that time, what were the professional golfers considered the best golfers, or at the time were the amateur golfers still considered the best golfers at the time?
There was no doubt that they were the best golfers. Okay. The very second year the Open amateurs were allowed to compete, many of them did compete. Well, compete in a manner of speaking, as in enter. Nobody got very close score-wise, even during all the early years of the Open. One person shot 232 for 36 holes at Prestwick, one amateur in the Open. So there was only really one player, a guy named William Dolman, who was a baker from Glasgow. And he was competitive, and he actually did win a professional event at Montrose in the 1860s. So, but by and large, amateurs were completely dwarfed by the professionals in terms of skill, and they knew that. And that's part of the reason that they staged great matches, because they wanted things to bet on, and it was pretty exciting to watch the professionals play, especially after Tommy came along, because Tommy was a pretty dashing brand of player, and so was Davy Strath, his main rival. So they kind of pepped up golf a little bit with the way they approached the game, too.
Of course, the backdrop to the Open this year is Royal Liverpool Golf Club, and something that I wasn't aware until I read your book, actually, was the prevalence of Royal Liverpool, the importance of Royal Liverpool when it comes to the Open. And it started much before really it got involved in the Open. Tell us a little bit more about the when young Tommy walks away with the belt after winning it at the age of 19 for the third time. Tell us a bit more about what the role of Royal Liverpool was in the upcoming years.
It's a great question, Tom, because Royal Liverpool is without any question at all the most important of the English clubs during the formative years of golf in England. It wasn't the first club. The first club founded in England was Royal North Devon in 1864, which old Tom Morris came down and laid out. And Hoylake, was 5 years behind that in 1869. But Hoylake, the men of Hoylake who ran that club were incredibly forward-thinking people. And not just at the very beginning, but all through the early history of the club. They had bold ideas that they put into action, and they had foresight as to where the game should go, really at a very transitional and transformational time in the game's history that I think is noteworthy, specifically as it relates to the Open. So 1870, Tommy claims the belt. What actually happens, Tom, is there's disagreement at Prestwick about what to do. There's a certain segment of the club, including the club president, Harry Hart, that wanted to keep everything exactly the way it was, just buy another belt, start the challenge over again. But there were other members of Prestwick who, as so often, were members of St. Andrews and other clubs too, in particular a great amateur player named Gilbert Mitchell Innes, who could see the bigger future. And they're like, if we really want this event to become something special, as it is on the verge of being now that the most famous golfer in the land has brought it to the attention of the whole nation, we need to get other clubs besides our own involved. And so there was infighting at Prestwick, and then Harry Hart kind of slow played getting it accomplished when he was outvoted by his own members to buy the claret jug and invite St. Andrews and Musselburgh. So a whole year went by before they finally reached an agreement for each club to put up £10 to buy the claret jug, and then each club to assume the expenses of hosting the Open in the years that they had the championship there and going forward. So there's a whole year that goes on. What does Hoylake do? Hoylake stages the biggest and the first professional golf tournament ever held on English soil. And they do it in a very forward-thinking, in their typical style way, and audacious way. The club raised £100 sterling for the purse of the Open Championship. The payout to the winner was £15. At that time, the Open paid £6, so it was more than more than twice what the Open paid. But the most important thing of all, Tom, is that they agreed that they would pay the railway expenses and hotel expenses of all players who elected to compete. So they found housing for them, they fed them dinner, and this is a time when professionals are sneered at completely. Really? Even at the original Open, only respectable caddies could get invited. Horace Hutchinson himself wrote that caddies were feckless, reckless creatures whose only loves were golf and whiskey, which I still don't see what's wrong with that. But so it was a big step forward for professional players. And it really was just a bold stroke from Hoylake. And every major player came. Tommy came, Davy Strath came. All the great players of that age gathered there. And it just brought huge attention to English golf at a time when it was growing reasonably steadily, but hadn't yet exploded, which really wouldn't happen until 1890.
Do we know much about the championship they held at Royal Liverpool? Do we know who won it? Do we know? Well, no, we know who won it, but...
So Tommy won. Actually, it was 36-hole event, as all of them were. Davy Strath, this was pivotal to the excitement of the tournament. He won the first 18, and then Tommy had to chase him down at the very last to win at the end, and he did do that, as he so often did with people. So it was an incredibly exciting tournament. And the other thing that I think is really important to the history of golf, and it just shows how all things connect together. And it isn't until you start to read from the beginning all the way through to the end that you start to see how everything ties together. Is one of the 10-year-old kids wandering around following Tommy adoringly is none other than John Ball Jr. of Hoylake, whose father was the proprietor of the hotel, the Royal Hotel, and who lived in the hotel and on the grounds of Hoylake all his life, pretty much, except the years when he was out on his farm. But he was following Tommy, and of course, he would be the player that would then go on to make the breakthrough for English golf. And it's just, to me, so fitting that it all ties together in that way, and it all traces back to the beginning.
Now we've got to kind of, it's taken us 18 minutes, but we've got to the crux of the podcast, because there's two figures that are central to Royal Liverpool's history that they are remarkable in their achievements, but not truly well known outside of people that do a lot of research into the history of these things. Obviously, the first one is the gentleman you just touched upon, John Ball Jr. The second one being Harold Hilton, which again we'll talk about a little bit later in the podcast. Tell us as if we don't know anything about John Ball Jr.
I think there's a couple things that contribute to that, Tom. John was a very reserved and shy man. He hated any kind of attention or publicity. When he lived at the hotel when he was a child, and the minute his grandfather passed away, his grandfather operated a farm some miles from town. John went out and wanted to work on the farm instead. He liked being by himself, and he just didn't like publicity. He wouldn't ever give interviews to reporters if they wanted to talk to him. One did finally corner him one day, and he said, "Well, I can't think of anything interesting for your readers at all. I just don't know what to say." And he didn't write a memoir. Every other key person in that age, Harry Varden, John Henry Taylor, James Braid at least wrote a full chapter about himself in one of his books, not a full memoir. And Hilton himself wrote a wonderful memoir. So they're all much better remembered because they told their story. He didn't want his story told. The other thing is, I think over the years, people have gotten what I would consider to be an intensely misguided idea about the amateur championship as to whether it constituted a major in the age of John Ball. And there isn't any doubt at all that it was a major championship. And I would venture to say that the vast majority of people in pre-war golf would have considered it more important than the Open Championship as an event. And, Ball won it 8 times over a period of 30 years, including as a 50-year-old man. It was he that Mickelson passed when he became the oldest major championship winner. And to fact that you have to win 6 or 7 18-hole matches, which everyone who plays golf knows that in an 18-hole match, any player can get on a 5-hole heater and defeat you. But not in a 36-hole match. And then, of course, you have to win the 36-hole final. And to do that 8 times staggers the imagination. Only Bonlac has come close with 5. No one will ever equal that record. That's probably one of the very few records in sports that's unassailable. And so that's something amazing. And it's a shame that he's not better remembered. But part of it is that his own choice, his own desire.
So rewinding back to the early days of John Ball Jr., he watches young Tommy around Royal Liverpool, and when does he start to enter into competitions? Obviously, young Tommy was 17 when he was winning majors. When does John Ball Jr. first appear in the record books?
John Ball entered his first championship at Prestwick in 1878, finished 4th, played quite well. He entered, there was no real distinction at that time between amateurs and professionals for the simple reason that the amateur championship hadn't been invented yet. Got to be a little bit of an awkward situation. He won £1 sterling for finishing 4th. And then when the amateur championship was invented at Hoylake in 1885, in 1868, John Ball would have been like 17 years old, or 16 years old, excuse me. So he was a teenage boy playing in his first championship, played well. He also played a great match against the Scotsman Dougie Rowland that got a lot of attention. Rowland killed him. John was like Bobby Jones in the sense he had a period of years where he had so much ability, but he didn't cash in on it in the way that you might have thought he would. But it wasn't until, in the amateur championship came along, the question was raised about Dougie Rowland entering, because he had also played in the Open and taken money. But Dougie Rowland had done it much more recently. Ball had not competed again for money since 1878. So here we are in 1885, and you can imagine what the committee at Hoylake does to decide this question. Is they decide that if you haven't taken money in X number of years, you can be an amateur. If you've taken it recently, you can't. So Dougie Rowland gets excluded and John Ball Jr. not. And Horace Hutchinson was so upset about that he resigned from the committee in advance of the vote because he thought it was grossly unfair to Dougie Rowland. Both of them took money. If that was going to be the standard, well, then neither of them could play. But anyway, probably best for golf that it happened that way in the long analysis. And so that just, that was his first foray into golf. And he played in the amateur too, starting in 1885, but struggled in his first few years and finally did win it in 1888.
Just touching on that slightly, because I know that there's a few bits to cover here. Hoylake was very progressive in all the things that it did. Tell us about how the amateur came about, because obviously that was something else that was pivotal to Royal Liverpool.
Yes, ever since the collapse of that first championship, there had naturally been a desire. Keep in mind that the vast majority of golfers are wealthy gentlemen, especially in England. Obviously, in Scotland, golf is a birthright. In England, children grow up playing cricket or football or rugby. They don't know anything about golf. So only wealthy gentlemen who knew Scotsmen that introduced them to the game really played golf during that age in England. It was quite, not very widespread at all. So wealthy gentlemen ran the game. They put up the stakes for the Open. They arranged all the schedules. They did everything. And naturally, there had always been a desire for a championship of their own. And it had been talked about in the press. It obviously had been tried out that one time as a foursomes competition. And finally, in 1885, Hoylake decided they were going to put on a championship for all amateur golfers, which they did do. It was an incredible success. But the thing I really think is important for your listeners, Tom, is this. What Hoylake did after the championship happened the first year was so important to the unfolding of the history of the game. This is one of the things I think the club deserves so much credit for. They wrote to St. Andrews immediately and asked St. Andrews to take charge of this new championship because they recognized, they could see the long vision of that. St. Andrews needed to be the one that ruled the game. Keep in mind, at this time, the game is spreading like topsy, but there's no authority. Everybody basically tries to adopt some version of the St. Andrews rules, which were in fact just copied from Leith Links in 1744. But there's nobody to say what happens if you have an adjustment for inland golf versus links golf, or so inconsistencies in the rules are developing, and there's a hue and cry for the game to be organized already happening. It doesn't get realized until 1897 when St. Andrews finally relents and forms the rules committee and begins taking charge of the game, which was what the vast majority of the golfing world wanted for them to do. But their interest was in tending their own garden primarily. And so the fact that Hoylake saw this as early as 1885, approached St. Andrews, and eventually St. Andrews did take charge of the amateur championship in the following year, literally. And that was really one of the very first demonstrations, along with the tournament in 1872, of the really forward-thinking way Hoylake was that would put such a big mark on the future of golf. And obviously the amateur itself, just creating the amateur championship and the lasting nature of that tournament is one of the biggest contributions by any single club.
Yeah. 1890 is a big year for both Royal Liverpool and for John Ball. What's the significance of John Ball and the Open in 1890?
In 1890, John Ball becomes the first Englishman and the first amateur player, and I think that part of it is really important, to win the Open Championship. And it's, at that time, there were 234 golf courses in all of Great Britain when John Ball stepped up to the first tee of Prestwick in 1890. When the war came, there were 1,200 in England alone. So it just, the explosiveness of growth in the aftermath of Ball's victory tells you how important it was to the evolution of the game of golf. Willie Park Jr., descendant of the famous Musselborough family of club makers, said he got so busy filling orders from Englishmen after the Ball's win in the Open that he basically could not play a game of golf for 3 years. It just, all he could do was keep up with orders. And, just golf went insane. And partly because, amateurs were now had that belief that they could defeat the professionals that they looked down their noses at, to be honest with you. That was a big part of the enthusiasm for it, is Ball had made it seem realistic that an amateur could beat the professionals in the Open, because he not only had he done it at the very birthplace of the Open itself at Prestwick on Scottish soil. So it was a moment in history that I think of as equivalent to Francis Ouimet winning the 1913 U.S. Open over Varden and Ray. It's that kind of time-changing moment for English golf, and it just sends English golf growth through the roof. There are periods in the immediate aftermath of that in the next 5 years where golf courses are being built at a rate of one a day all through England. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah, that 1892, 1893 was a absolute explosion in golf, because our very own Blackwell was 1893. They all kind of just exploded around that time. Is it fair to say?
Hilton came right after that too. See, so in 1892, just 2 years later, at Muirfield, Hilton wins, and so in a period of 3 years, you have two amateur winners of the Open. So both Englishmen, and you can see how that just stokes the English interest in golf, because I take it you're an Englishman. And
I'm a Welshman, Stephen.
You're a Welshman. Okay.
Yeah,
so
let's just hide it well.
Look at it here. But the Englishman, when he picks up something, his natural desire is to vanquish the Scot, especially if it happens to be the Scotsman's national pastime, and to prove that he can beat them. So, that became a big stimulus for English golf when Englishmen were able to beat Scots at their own game.
Is it fair to say that sort of the Open, the amateur, well, certainly the Open, not the amateur, but the Open came in sort of waves of, like you say, the professionals were by and large the best players at the time at the very beginning. Then there was this big surge of amateur, not dominance, but amateur really competing well. And then there's there's this big wave of amateur golf that kind of just sort of drifts off, and you get this changeover. That period between 1888, 1887 towards, 1930, really. We really saw a lot of amateurs doing very well.
The amateur, I would say that for the 10 years that followed John Ball's victory, amateurs are seriously competitive. Okay, they have 3 of the Opens, 2 of them won by Hilton and 1 of them by Ball. So 3 Opens in 10 years are won by an amateur. They have many, many second and third place finishes from people like Freddie Tate, John Laidley, Muir Ferguson, and they continue to be somewhat competitive in the following decade. But honestly, Tom, what really happens is a surge of English professionals. When golf started growing in England, every club that opened wanted a Scottish professional, because a Scottish professional was the stamp of authenticity at that time. And there weren't very many English professionals, for the simple reason that the game was just starting there. And there hadn't really been very many people who took up golf as a professional in England in the way that young boys who were caddies in St. Andrews went on to be ball makers or club makers or professionals in that way. So it just, golf developed a little differently in England in that regard. But by the mid-1890s, the growth had become so epically fast that the English professional was beginning to emerge. Tom Varden, who was Harry's brother, went off to become a professional in 1888, and very soon afterwards, he was followed by his brother Harry, by John Henry Taylor, going off to Burnham and Barrow. And so there started to be a class of English professionals. And of course, golf is growing so fast in England that by 1894, the Open Rota is expanded to include an English course. And the tournament is held at Royal St. George's. And that's partly because Royal St. George's had, very influential people in London that were members. And they were also members of other highly influential clubs. And they got the first one partly because of Dr. William Laidlaw Purvis and Henry Lamb. But the, John Henry Taylor, an Englishman, won that Open in 1894, which, could be written off by the Scots in the sense of it was a distant English course that not all of them could get to, and unfamiliar links to the Rota, so forth and so on. But he pretty much scotched all that the following year by marching into St. Andrews and winning the Open again there in 1895. And so that, really starts this whole wave of English golf professionals. And it's Harold Hilton writes about it in his memoir when he starts to see, he sees John Henry Taylor play for the first time at Prestwick and open with a 75 in unspeakable weather. And he realizes that the end is near for the competitive amateur when he sees that, and he sees Varden. Hilton was a smart man, and he could see the future too. So he writes in his memoir about how he didn't think they had much longer to go, and he was very right about that. And so that was more of the thing that overcame the amateur in England, was the arrival of many professionals. It's sort of the same way in the United States, Tom. When the games moved to the United States in 1910, 1913, 3 amateurs win in 10 years there as well. And amateurs stay fairly competitive till Bobby Jones in 1930. But that's partly because there wasn't yet a full bevy of American professionals. And of course, in the years when the American professional golf got to be what it became, the amateurs faded away there just as well. But they did enjoy halcyon days, that's for sure, from 1890, say, through about 1905 or so.
The early 1890s, you've got 2 Royal Liverpool members that are highly competitive, with John Ball and Harold Hilton. Give us a little bit of background about Harold Hilton and maybe the connection between the two.
Well, Hilton grew up idolizing Ball. Ball was the superstar of Hoylake when Hilton was a young boy. Hilton was born there in Wirral, and his father was in the insurance business. He ran an insurance company. And Hilton and Ball both went to the same local public school up through 6th grade. Hilton did go on to Norfolk County School and get some additional schooling, whereas Ball just went to work like most working class English boys did at that time, although Ball was the son of a hotel proprietor, so he was middle class, but he didn't do any more schooling than the average working class child would have done. Hilton did go to the school. Hilton, he ended up learning golf from, we were talking a minute ago about one of the early golf professionals, and one of the earliest of them was a man from Wirral named Willie Moore. And Willie Moore was one of these guys who had a million scientific theories about the golf swing. And he taught Hilton how to play golf. And Hilton was truly fascinated by all the intricacies of the swing. And over his lifetime, he probably learned more about the golf swing and the game of golf than any other person of that age. He was such a bright mind. He grew up to be the editor of Golf Monthly and later Golf Illustrated, wrote a few books himself. But he really became the master of the swing in every way. He could fade his ball, he could hook his ball, he could do anything he wanted with his ball, whereas John Ball was just relentlessly straight, remorselessly and relentlessly straight, right down the middle every time in a way that was soul-crushing if you were playing against him. So Hilton, he had a tough life in a lot of ways. He had a hard time before he got to editing, finding a niche that he was happy in. He sold cigarettes for a while, which is probably a good thing since he never was seen without a cigarette in his mouth, I don't think. I was mentioning earlier the great match between Dougie Rowland and John Ball. Well, when Hilton was in school, somebody was babbling on about how Rowland was this great player and so forth and so on. And Hilton was, there's nobody that can beat John Ball. And he bet the guy a shilling. And of course, Rowland won and he had to pay the shilling. And it was very sad. But, he went on and, he was right in the footsteps of Ball, winning, the same kinds of medals at Hoylake that John won as a child. And, obviously, in 1892, he wins the Open Championship following in Ball's footsteps. He wins it again in 1897, and 1892 was at Muirfield, the first one, and the course was very short then, like 5,200 yards. There's a lot of ambiguity as about whether it was really a fair championship test, and an anxiety over that, partly because it had moved from Musselburgh the previous year. That I would say was a win that wasn't as convincing as the one he would win in 1897 at Hoylake, where he beat James Braid. James Braid had a putt to win, to tie him on the last hole and couldn't get it in. But, those were great wins. And I think the thing that's interesting, too, about Hilton to me is he had two other chances to win the Open that were really close. In 1898, this is Varden at the absolute peak of his powers at Prestwick. Hilton takes out the wrong club when he's playing the Himalayas and makes a terrible shot and ends up getting an 8, and he loses the tournament by a stroke.
Wow.
So he had a chance there. He came in 1907 when Arno Massey, when in another tournament later, I think it was 1907, but in any case, he came to the 16th hole at Hoylake in an Open, needing 13 strokes to win. And so just 2 5s and a 4. I mean, two 4s and a 5 to win after on 16, 17, 18, which obviously quite difficult holes, but that's manageable. That's very manageable. He ended up getting in a bunker and getting a double bogey, and that was pretty much all she wrote. But I often wonder how the world would look at Harold if he had won either of those two, and they were both extremely winnable for him. And that was a time when most other amateurs had already been eclipsed, by the pros.
What do we know about Hilton's list of achievements in all realms of golf?
He won the amateur 4 times, and he also was the first man to complete the transatlantic double, which is really big. He won in 1911. He won the amateur championship, and then went over to the United States and won the U.S. amateur in a very dramatic final against a guy named Fred Herreshoff, where they're coming to the extra holes, and Herreshoff is out in front of him. Herreshoff, the real bomber. Hilton hits his trusty spoon toward the green, but he flies it way right, and it looks like it's headed for absolute oblivion, but it bounces off something. It was sort of hard to see from various locations. Some people thought it was a rock. Some people just thought it took a good bounce on the hill. But in any case, it ended up 15 feet from the flag, and Hilton ends up winning the championship. I think there's a plaque on that rock still, where Hilton's Lucky Rock or something to that effect. So that was a big moment in history. And he was the first of only 4 people, I think, Lawson Little, Bobby Jones, and a man named, an obscure golfer named, I forget his name now, Dick Chapman or something, also have done the transatlantic double, but only 4 times in history, and he was the first time. So that was pretty major. I would say that, he has the 4 wins in the amateur, but I think his amateur record is clouded by the fact that both times he played against Freddie Tate, the great Scotsman, in an amateur, he was absolutely obliterated. Freddie just had his number, and the beatings were so bad.
What do we know about those matches?
Freddie, one of them was in the 1896 championship and one was in the 1898 amateur. Both times Freddie went on to win, and I think Hilton got beat like 8-7. But they were just bad drubbings. One of them in front of Hoylake with Harold's wife watching was a particularly difficult blow for him, as he explains in his diary emotionally. And, all of his friends there at Hoylake. And Freddie just crushed him. And then, of course, Freddie being Freddie, played Cock of the North on his bagpipes while he was marching up and down Market Street the night after the tournament. So that probably didn't add any salve to Hilton's wounds there. But he just, both times he played him, he got beaten really bad. It was, I forget the exact scores now. I'm sorry, Tom. But
no, the knowledge is encyclopedic. I don't blame you.
It was a trouncing. But, Hilton was a very competitive match play golfer. He had a final against John Lowe at St. Andrews. Was one of the great amateur matches of all time. So I think he's a little bit unfairly tarnished by the fact that people think, well, yeah, he won 2 more amateurs, but Freddie was dead by then, and would he have won him if Freddie was still alive? And I don't know. I mean, obviously none of us can know the answer to that question, but if he had to face Freddie, I would think his chances weren't that great. Because sometimes you've done it, Tom. You play against a golfer that for whatever reason you can't beat that guy.
That seems to be most golfers for me, Stephen. I don't know why. I just can't beat them.
Freddie was that guy for poor Harold because Harold was a fairly dominant golfer, and but Freddie he just couldn't play against.
Royal Liverpool is, it's an outstanding place, and it's amazing for what it's done, kind of planting the seed for getting professionals to compete. It's then kind of developed the amateur. It kind of comes up with a first iteration, I suppose, of a transatlantic competition also.
Yes, they do. And that is another thing that the club deserves all the credit in the world for. Literally, Tom, even before the amateur championship in 1883, there was a guy from England who styled himself St. George. People used nom de plumes when they wrote letters to the editor most of the time in that day. Sort of like being on Twitter, I guess. Anyway,
anonymity.
Himself St. George, and he was writing a letter to the field saying, "Where are the Scotsmen who can beat John Ball and Horace Hutchinson? Let's have a match and prove who's better." This is, the amateur championship has not even been founded yet. Golf is, taking root in England, but it's not like wildfire as it would be after John Ball's victory. So early on and throughout the age, there was a cry for a match between Scotland and England in any capacity that you could have it. So a lot of the great matches, for instance, would be between an Englishman and a Scotsman, and all that sort of thing. 1899, for instance, between Varden and Willie Park Jr. But in 1902, Hoylake again takes the initiative and stages the first international amateur match. And they set up a team of selectors in England and a team of selectors in Scotland to pick, I'm going to forget the number of players on the team, but I think it was 10 players aside. And then they had a format of singles matches and foursome matches like the Ryder Cup. And it's worth noting that on the English side, the first time around was Bernard Darwin, the great golf writer, for the very first English side in 1902. And that match was a massive success. It overshadowed every other golf event that happened that year because the whole backdrop of that age is this great rivalry between England and Scotland for supremacy at golf. And, that was, really starts with Ball winning. And then the next year, it's such a big deal that the very next year, the PGA, the newly formed Professional Golfers Association, which had just formed in 1901, started an international professional match to parallel the one had by the amateur. So the international amateur match would take place in advance of the amateur championship, and the international professional match would take place in advance of the Open. And because most players on both sides would be competing in those events, so it made it convenient from a travel standpoint and so forth and so on. And that is the basis for everything that happens in the future in terms of Curtis Cups, Walker Cups, Ryder Cups, Solheim Cups. All of that international match play has the seed planted that year in 1902 at Hoylake. So that's how I see it, and I think history supports that. And it's just they have so many wonderful accomplishments as a club that, I think hopefully when the Open comes there again this summer, people be able to properly celebrate the club for everything it's given to our game, which to my mind is a lot of the very best things in the game.
Is it fair to say that without Royal Liverpool, I think the game would be in a very different place than it is now?
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think Horace Hutchinson himself, Horace was the leading figure of the early pre-war age. He was twice amateur champion himself. He was a golf editor of Country Life. He was a member of the Royal and Ancient and the first English non-royal captain of the Royal and Ancient Golf Club. So he was just a massive figure. And he himself wrote, and it's quoted in my book, that, if it weren't for the forward-thinking men of Hoylake, we in the South might never have come into our golfing heritage. He literally credits them with a lot of the growth of golf in the South of England, and it's absolutely what they deserve. They were just out on the front of everything. And as I say, it was particularly important to my mind that they understood the role that St. Andrews needed to play in guiding the game forward. And some of that, Tom, is because Hoylake had intense ties to St. Andrews from the very day of its birth. So we can just review those briefly. The club is formed in 1869 by a Scotsman named John Muir Dowie. He's a Scottish businessman in Liverpool, and he has a lot of English friends, obviously, who join the club. He is married to the daughter of Robert Chambers, who is the publisher of Chambers' Edinburgh Journal, the man who wrote the poem about Tommy after Tommy died, and who also was the winner of one of those amateur championships in 1857, 1858, and 1859 that were held in advance of the Open. He had his own personal golf professional, as many rich people did, and it happened to be George Morris, Tom's brother. So George Morris comes down to Hoylake, lays out the golf course, the first 9-hole course, with Robert Chambers. That's when the first golf is played. He brings his son Jack with him. His son Jack becomes the golf professional at Hoylake and stays there for 60 years. So they are very, very intimately tied into the St. Andrews golfing set from the very day of their birth. And part of the reason I believe that they had such a forward-thinking view of matters was that they understood the importance of St. Andrews in a way maybe a club like Royal Wimbledon, which was formed mostly by quite proud Englishmen, might not have had.
And I think it's no coincidence. And when we talk with Joe and talk about the early 9-hole routing there at Royal Liverpool, that the early course and the way how it looked was not dissimilar to how the old course was. It wasn't crashing dunes. It was on relatively flat land with slightly modest topography, but it was no land movement and trying to get what they could out of the land, the best they could get out of the land, and restricted by horse racing and everything else that went on around there. The ties and the similarities between the two places are quite deep.
Yes, they are. What Bernard write about Hoylake, it was rather hard and bare and bumpy and takes some man to conquer it, something to that effect. Yeah. So at the very beginning, Hoylake was a very rugged course, and it was incredibly narrow. Jamie Anderson, the great winner of 3 Open championships, who followed Tommy and actually caddied for Tommy in a lot of Tommy's important matches. They were close friends. Jamie Anderson played the first hole at Hoylake, and I think he knocked 2 or 3 of them right out of bounds. It's a very narrow little thing there. And he said, "My God, it's like playing up a spout." So it's a very difficult course and remains so to this day. I had the great fortune of playing it in 2019, right before COVID, when I came over to support my Tommy book and was doing some research for my second book, The Long Golden Afternoon. I played Hoylake and toured the clubhouse and everything. And it's just such an impressive facility and so steeply, rich in history inside that clubhouse. I was really amazed by it. It's as nice as anything I've been in, and that includes the Royal and Ancient. So it's quite a lovely place, and I just think it's one of the great institutions in all of golf. And so I'm always excited when the Open comes back there.
Stephen, you've been very, very generous with your time, but the pod primarily based around John Ball Jr. and Harold Hilton. So I think as a parting gift, who was better? I know that's not fair.
I don't think there's any doubt that John Ball Jr. is the best amateur golfer that Britain has ever produced, or really? Probably ever produced. John had a singular capacity to reel his man in when he felt like winning, which is just a supreme quality of match play. He would literally say he got bored playing hole, having to walk very far if he finished somebody off early. He didn't like that. The hole that was closest to the clubhouse at Hoylake at the time that John Ball was playing was the 16th. You could just walk right off the golf course and into the clubhouse from there. That was the done in those days. And he would always say to his caddy, if he got a big lead, "Look, we'll just dangle him along and finish him off at the done." And then he would just let the guy have holes or win holes as necessary to keep the match going, just mainly so he could just practice and play real golf. And then at the 16th, he would hit some heroic shot and finish the guy off, shake hands, and walk into the clubhouse. That was how great he was at match play. And I got to tell, before we go, my favorite John Ball story of all time, because I know you will love this, Tom. John Ball was not a man you wanted to make angry on the golf course. He was quiet and he reserved, but he had a fierceness to him that could be quite frightening. So he's playing in the finale of the Irish Amateur Championship. It's a 36-hole match. They're scheduled at least for 36 holes. And there's a mix-up. Golf is a lot less formal in those days. There's a mix-up. Starter has given John the wrong time. So he walks up to the tee late. And when he arrives at the tee, his partner is, berating the starter, demanding that ball be disqualified for being late. And he has a boat to catch to Scotland that night. He can't be having all this tardiness and this and that and the other thing. Ball doesn't say a word. The starter just says, hey, look, it was my mistake. We're going to play golf. Go tee off. Ball never says a word during the entire match. He just annihilates the guy. He finishes him off 13 and 11. Okay, so it's like the worst possible meeting. And then when he holds the winning putt, he reaches over and shakes the guy's hand and says, and now, sir, you may catch your boat.
And on that note, I think that's a brilliant. And Stephen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast again. I think your encyclopedic knowledge of the history of the game is unmatched. And I think if anyone wants to find out about any things that you've talked about, of course, you've got your two books, The Monarch of the Green and The Long Golden Afternoon. They are available. And of course, the magazine that's coming out shortly. But Stephen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's always a pleasure to be on Cookie Jar. I love the Allenmouth video, by the way. I'm desperate to get there and play that 9-holer now. And just very much enjoy the work that all of you do, and wish you the very best going forward with it.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Watch this.